If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. What have you seen that made you believe in paranormal things? Okay. There I was in my best friend's house, with my now ex-GF. All of a sudden, a rapid tapping on my bedroom door. I thought it was my friend scrounging for a condom or something. Open the door and no one is out there. About to head back in when I hear the door pop open down the hall. It's my friend's head popping out, asking if I had knocked at his door. We were both in the hallway laughing about it at this point. Then, the sound of footsteps made their way up the stairs towards us. We could track each step on each floorboard. It stopped 2 steps from the top. There was no one there. Still slept like a baby that night. I've had a similar experience to this when I was young. I have only told a few people about this, and as I got older I've kind of kept it to myself. I haven't talked about it in years. When I too was 9, maybe 10, I got really scared trying to sleep one night. So I ran to my mom's bedroom and told her I couldn't sleep. I stayed with her that night. It must have been a couple hours later, I was awakened by a bright light in her bedroom. My mother did not wake up. I looked over her shoulder and I saw a white figure kind of hovering over her or right next to her. I do not remember seeing wings, but she appeared to be female and looked exactly like my mother, but years younger in appearance. She had her hands folded and she was smiling down at my mother. She then looked at me and smiled at me. I did not get that feeling of calmness. I felt terrified. I remember rubbing my eyes really hard and burying myself under my mom because I was scared. I didn't want to look up again, but I needed to know if this was real or if I was imagining this. I slowly peeked up again. And she was there. I was scared frozen. I was too afraid to run out of the room, plus I was in the safest spot in the world, by my mom. I stayed real close to my mom and tried waking her up. I whispered, for fear of startling it, to please wake up. Wake up. I said something is here. I didn't know how to explain it. My mom just mumbled and kept sleeping. I then closed my eyes real tight and never opened them again the rest of the night. I eventually fell asleep, and when I woke up in the morning I avoided looking that direction entirely. I even remember putting my hand over my left side of my face as a shield to avoid looking at that side of the room. I ran out the room and down the hall. It wasn't until around midday, maybe a few hours later, I was brave enough to look back down the hall and into my mother's room again. As I brought up the courage to look back at the room, I saw a somewhat large blob of what seemed like gas. I knew then, that I did not dream this. There it was, not as a figure but as a gas-like object. I didn't bring this up to anyone, not even my family, for years. When I was about 15, my brother and I were having a conversation and we brought up our past. I mentioned this to him for the first time. What shocked me was his response. He saw it too. Not seen but heard. I made an advertising blog back in college, and one night I saw a commercial for one of Taco Bell's new Big Crazy Burritos, so I decided to give it a try. It was around midnight when I started driving there. During which I decided to make a voice recording to capture my thoughts and feelings to blog about them later. I was going 60 miles per hour down a highway when it happened. It was as if I drove through the sound of a bunch of screaming children. Not necessarily frightened screams, more like you would hear at the pool or an amusement park. The screams lasted around 5 seconds, and moved slowly from the front to the back of my car. Felt like I drove through a sound cloud. It was dark, moving fast, I was the only car on the road, and there were definitely no children nearby. When I was 6 years old, I was asleep in my bed, lying on my stomach. I woke up from someone tapping me on the back. I sat up in bed and saw my great uncle, who was hit and killed by a drunk driver, as was my great aunt at the same time. I remember being excited to see him and not afraid, because I had missed him so much. Now, I can no longer remember everything we talked about, but I know he said he loved me and wanted me to tell other family members he loved them too. He looked normal, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, but he seemed wispy. I remember asking him where my aunt was, and my uncle replied, he would only let one of us come. I was a Christian at the time and so assumed that he was God. I asked my uncle to wait while I got my mom, but by the time I came back, he was gone. I went to see the Whaley House in San Diego. It's said to be the most haunted house in North America, but I don't know how true that is. I will say that the place is fucked up. I've never seen a ghost before, but the way I felt there and the things I saw had no explanation. In an upstairs room, there were these small, bright orbs of light that would shoot off in all directions. I took a lot of pictures, and in the ones of the courtroom, a room in the house that was later turned into a courtroom, you can see what most people think is a demon or some entity. It's gray and looks to be crouching forward as if to spring in a corner of the room that is supposedly a portal of some sort. There is a lot of haze in these pictures, although the room was perfectly clear. After seeing that, and the sense of dread/heaviness/dizziness I felt on the property, I do believe there is some sort of spirit world out there. I was 2 when my grandfather died. Woke up in the middle of the night to him at the end of my bed, first memory I can recall too. We talked all night, and in the morning I apparently repeated nearly word for word him and my mother's last conversation before he passed. I was being babysat by my grandmother when I saw 3 American Indian women in full regalia in our home. They looked really nice and I told my mom about them. Apparently my grandmother had seen them too, but she said they weren't happy she was there. I had this teddy bear I'd had for years. I'd always leave in my grandmother's room. She lived with us at this point, and I'd usually leave it on the floor being a kid, and she'd always prop it up on her bed. She died when I was 11 and I moved into her room. One night I got up because I couldn't sleep and my mother was the only other one awake. We watched TV for a couple hours, then I went back to bed. That teddy bear was sitting straight up on the edge of my bed, which was only a twin, and it was on the side I had to get out of. It gave me the absolute creeps and I forced my mother to get rid of it. Also, I lost a child while pregnant 5 years ago. The only ones who know are a couple of my best friends and my ex. Well, my mother volunteers at a huge historical cemetery in our area, and they had a medium and some paranormal guys tour the place a couple years ago. They went to dinner afterwards and he asked about her daughter. She'd never mentioned me once. He apparently guessed my age, which is weird because my mother was 37 when she had me, so it's a little strange to have a child my age, and he asked about my son. She said I didn't have a child, and he said then, who is this little boy about 2 years old that I see walking with her everywhere? My child at that time would have been exactly 2. When I was 14, I agreed to look after my neighbor's cats while they were away. They left me a key to their house and I was supposed to go over once every day to feed the cats and check on them. But when I was walking over the following evening, I saw an older woman in one of the windows of the upper floor, staring at me. I got a little confused and turned, walking back home thinking that maybe I had mistaken the day or if they got someone else to check on the cats. The next day, same thing happened. I walked over again and I saw the same woman staring at me from a window, but this time on the first floor. I called my neighbor then, and they got worried and told me to call the police because no one was supposed to be in there. I called, the police came, but the house was empty, except for the cats. I stayed in the house while the police left and fed the cats. I left soon after. I came over and fed the cats as I had promised, but the whole thing gave me the creeps. I never saw the woman again. But the cats refused to leave the live-in room. I was born and raised in the South. Rural Georgia, to be specific. Less than an hour from Savannah. It's a very spiritual region. You grow up with Baptists, you learn that there are some otherworldly forces out there that can protect you or mean you real harm. An example of the former, when I was real young, we had a tornado come through in the middle of the night. Me and my little sister slept through the whole thing on the couch with our new puppy, Guinevere. The following morning, it was pure devastation, everywhere. Trees down, lines down. A fallen trunk had crushed my aunt's car clean in half. But there wasn't a scratch on our little trailer. It was like a barrier had been placed around us. Like some benevolent force had raised a hand and stayed destruction from us so thoroughly, the raging storm never even woke us up. Now, for an example of the latter. My mother is one of those empath things. She doesn't necessarily see dead folks, but she can feel when that spiritual pressure begins to build. For years, when I was young, she would be bedridden all the time with migraines and immense headaches. She and my dad didn't tell me why. Why would they? But they believed there was a lot of energy coursing through that backwoods area. I told them once that the hall window made me nervous at night. The next day, my dad had a NASCAR flag pinned over it. It wasn't until years later that they told me about the thing that had it out for us. Looking back, I understand it now. Some of those bad entities, they can tell when you can sense them. The one on our land knew my mom could tell where it was. Lurking at the edge of the yard, a hall window at night. And it didn't like that very much. It would target my mom specifically. It was part of why her head hurt all the time. It would take her paper plate out of the trash can in the closet at night, and leave it on the counter for Dad to find. That kind of thing. One night, my dad encountered it for himself. He woke up in the middle of the night and was having a smoke in the kitchen, when he noticed something through the window. He stepped out onto the front porch, and there it was. A black shape just sitting on the edge of our trampoline a few yards beyond the reach of the porch light. He told it, firmly, to beat it. Leave. Stop messing with his wife and kids and leave us alone. It responded by rearing up at him and making a snorting sound. Challenging him as if to say, and what's you do if I don't? My dad bolted back inside. I moved here to Alabama when I was 13. That place is a distant memory now. But my experiences didn't stop there. Since 2012, I've been an off and on volunteer at the local museum complex. 2 of them. One natural history, and the other a world history museum full of antique weaponry founded by a married couple of old World War II spies. My experiences are from this museum. There are thousands of items in the collection. Only 13% of it is on display at any time. The rest is in the basement. My mother, now the registrar at these museums, has her office down there, right beneath a massive shelf loaded with antique bronzes. Staring down at her. Joy. Now, I said the museum was founded by World War II spies. As such, it is overwhelmingly interesting and/or clandestine antique weaponry. Many of these weapons have tasted blood before. It stands to reason energies or spirits are attached to any number of them. We have no way of knowing. But there are several entities that live in the basement where my mom works. They have different personalities. One is a casual observer, who lives inside a giant wooden Buddhist statue. The kind with a square hole in the side to insert prayers. Bodhisattva Guanyin? Pronounced like that. Another is a joker who likes to move things. Once, me, my mom, my sister, and one other volunteer were taking inventory. We had the huge wall vault of weapons open, moving items in and out. My sister goes to put a crossbow back in a corner of the vault. When she turned around, an old can of survival water that had been in this corner had moved. It was then on the floor. In the middle of the aisle. Behind her. With the label facing directly at her. She thought one of us had done it as a joke. We 3 were all the way over at my mom's desk. Lastly, there's the mean one. He doesn't like you. He doesn't like anyone. He is a being of invisible, concentrated hate and malice. My mom calls him Big Nasty. He will push over dangerous weapons near you. Or, more commonly, he will rush you. You won't see anything. But you'll be able to feel a dark, evil freight train of rage barrel from the far end of the basement, right up to you and just stop, towering over you and seething with contempt. He likes to do that when you're turning the lights off. Real charmer, that bastard. Then there's the stuff you do see. Once, I was coming down the stairwell to the basement door. It's the same kind of double door you see in schools, metal, with the rectangular window reinforced with the crisscross in wires. As I stepped onto the final landing at the top of the last flight from the bottom, I turned to face the door. From my position, for a fraction of an instant, I saw someone move away from the window. It was so fast, my brain didn't register hair color or skin color or clothing. Literally nothing distinguishable other than a human shape, leaning away from the window. Me, I thought it was my mom peeking while waiting to startle me, as she does that sometimes for funnies. When no one peeked again, I slowly made my way down and pushed the door open. I round the corner and she's at her desk. I fill her in and she just nods. Happens all the time. It's very hard to describe what happens, when it happens. You see movement. But there's nothing there. But how can nothing move? It's mind-bending, seeing what you thought was a head of red hair moving between 2 shelves only to dissolve in midair before your brain even gets its shit together. Then of course there's the touching. I should note it isn't confined to the basement. You could be on the 2nd floor in the World Wars exhibits, and feel someone run a finger up the back of your arm. Other times it's not as mind, and you'll actually get a push. To sum up, I am a very logical person. I believe in science, and am very grounded. But I grew up being shielded from dark forces by my Baptist elders and have spent my whole life bathed in superstition and witnessing shit like you wouldn't believe. I believe we live in reality. But I don't think we as beings are fully attuned to what reality is, 100%. I think we only see a narrow vertical slice of the real world. We rub elbows with gods and demons every day without even knowing. Back when I was 7 or 8 years old, I'm currently 31, I woke up at around 3 a.m. needing the toilet. I got out of bed, headed to the bathroom and took care of business. Upon exiting the bathroom, I noticed something rather inexplicable on the staircase just a few feet to the left of the bathroom door. A sliver of pure white light no more than 5 to 6 in length and probably only a few centimeters in width was bouncing up the stairs in a slow, methodical manner. I stood in silence watching this thing, utterly transfixed. I quickly came back to my senses as the light reached the top of the stairs, turned toward me and began to take its first bounce in my direction. I became suddenly and acutely aware of the strange nature of this encounter, as I assume any self-respecting 7 to 8-year-old would do. I ran back into my room and hid under my duvet. Fortunately, sleep must have taken me almost immediately because the next thing I knew it was broad daylight. I've had a lot of weird things happen in my life, But that one stuck with me because to this day I have no rational explanation for whatever it was. Oh, and I cannot stress this enough, I was fully awake. This wasn't some kind of dream, and I wasn't sleepwalking. I was every bit as conscious as I would be throughout any given day. Very strange. My old house was built about 90 some odd years ago. All ex-bankers and financial people lived in there, and in all, 5 out of 6 owners had something to do with finance, my father included. My dad and mom would leave for long weekends, and when I was old enough to stay alone, I would. Things would go missing, like hammers, game controllers, etc., and I'd find them later under couches and on top of cabinets a few weeks later. It got to the point where I'd pray to St. Anthony and find my objects in a matter of hours than weeks. Another pretty crazy experience, I lived in the attic. One night, I had a dream I got attacked by a demon and it slashed me up really good. I woke up with claw marks or something, not actual cuts but definitely hard scratch marks all up and down my back, and could see 2 red glowing eyes at the end of my room. My room was about 25 by 8, it really was a huge room. Sobbed myself to sleep that night after the eyes disappeared. My dad the next day asked me if I was up super late cause he could hear a lot of movement from upstairs. I am a firm believer in the paranormal after that godforsaken house. I'm part of an amateur ghost hunting / paranormal investigation group. I'm mainly a skeptic, and my first step is always debunking. We were investigating at a site that we have been to quite a few times. A private business that was housed in a building that was originally a brothel in the 1800s. The basement of this building was always quite creepy, and you could see the original foundation as well as some tunnels that had been filled in. I was sitting on the top of the steps leading down to the basement, a teammate was sitting at the bottom of the stairs. We were just listening for anything weird, and had the recorders going. The area was dimly lit from the electronics going. After some time something shouted in my right ear, in a language I did not understand, and I was grabbed by the neck and pulled downwards. This freaked me out a bit, and I scrambled up the stairs pretty quickly. My teammate WTF'd and asked me what was up. I told him what I experienced. He didn't see / hear anything. There were no animals on site and no evidence of any being present could be found. I worked third shift, so I couldn't really attribute it to being tired or anything, and this was fairly early on in the investigation anyway. Not outright saying it was a demon or a ghost or something, but I can't readily explain what happened to me. My sister sees stuff all the time, and apparently my cousin and uncle do too. Me, not so much. One time I was at Seth's uncle's house and I felt the hairs on my neck stand up, and out of the corner of my eye I see this pale, white-gowned lady with long black hair slowly walking down the stairs. Inside I was freaking the fuck out, but I calmly asked my sister if there was any kind of female spirits around the house. She nonchalantly told me there was a spirit who frequented the place, a woman in a white gown with long black hair, and that our uncle and cousin see her around, too. Because the only description I gave to my sister was female spirit, yet she still described the spirit in detail. I believe the only logical explanation for her knowing that information is that the spirit was real. I didn't see the lady spirit again, but there have been a couple times, at the same house, where I've heard people whispering conversations when there was no one else around me in the middle of the night. I ran to my bed and hid under the covers each time it happened. Another story, by my sister, was when I was home alone doing whatever on MySpace. My sister and her friend walk through the door and call my little sister's name out. I tell them no one else is home. They then asked, "Then who was upstairs at the window waving at us?" I volunteer every summer at a religious shrine on the east coast of England. The place is over 950 years old, and the accommodation I am given there is in a part of the building that dates back several hundred years. I went there a couple of years back, and collapsed into bed nearly straight away as I had traveled all day to get there. Woke up around 3 a.m. to a woman's voice, broad Yorkshire accent, asking, "Are y'all right, love?" I said yes I was, the way you do when you've just been woken up and are a bit fuzzy-headed, and the next minute I'm sitting up in bed with the light on asking myself what the hell just happened. Ran into a member of staff the next morning, and all I said was that something weird had happened the night before. He asked what room I was in, and when I told him, his reply was, "Oh, what did she say to you?" Made me feel a bit better knowing I wasn't the only one to hear this. Another year, I was housed in the same building but in a room that overlooked the street outside. Every night I would be woken up by the sound of horses walking past, but when I looked out of the window I saw nothing, even though the sound was right there. The shrine was destroyed by Henry VIII before being rebuilt nearly 400 years later. There is a field nearby called the Martyrs' Field, so it's obvious what happened there, and the village has also housed a leper hospital and a prison. My late father, who visited the area frequently, Used to say he'd be surprised if the entire place wasn't seething with ghosts. I was never a believer in ghosts until I went to boarding school. One night shortly before 9 p.m. I ran down to the faculty in charge desk to ask if the library was still open because I needed to print something out. Whomever it was said yes, they thought so. I went down towards the library. To get to the library you had to pass through a set of double doors which were usually open. Once you passed the doors there was a set of stairs going up to a sun deck and a set going down to what had once been the pool. Beyond the stairs was a brief hallway, then the library. So I walked down towards the library and the double doors were closed. I pulled on one and it's still open, so thinking nothing of it, I continued on to the library. I got to it and it was closed. I turned around and walked back to the double doors and found the lock from the inside. The doors had windows, forgot to say that. I figured sooner or later someone would walk down the hall that led to the doors and I could yell and get their attention. I'm standing there watching the hallway for someone for about 10 minutes, when I hear the sound of footsteps coming up from the aforementioned pool area. I turn expecting to see someone who can possibly let me out. Then the footsteps go running past me and I heard "Let's go play" on the sun deck and I can clearly see no one is there. I started screaming bloody murder and banging on the doors. Someone finally heard me and let me out. I figured everyone would think I was nuts if I told them, so I just said I was afraid because I was locked in. Later in the school year I found out my school had once been a school for little girls in the late 1800s and 2 little girls died by falling off the sun deck. When we arrived to Mexico, I was about 11 or 12 years old. Went to live with my aunt for a few years, big nice 2-story 3-bedroom house. Let's say my aunt got on a few people's bad side, and those people were fan of witchcraft, black magic, all that stuff that try to find logical explanations for once they happen. My aunt and her husband left for a small vacation to Mazatlan and just me and my 2 cousins were left in the house. One morning we found a black rooster dead outside the house. We didn't think nothing of it and just cleaned and got back to business. That night we heard the front door bust open. It was a heavy door with metal frames. You'll probably need some tool to bust that baby open. My female cousin, 12, that we'll call AC, came crying into my male cousin's 9 room, we'll call him JC. Being the oldest man-child in the house, I took it to myself to check what's going on. So I lead a scout down the stairs to see what's going on. If you angle just right from the stairs, you can see straight to the front door, which was intact. Well, the moment I reached the ground floor all the lights went out, the kitchen cabinets started shaking, opening and closing, slamming shut. We ran back to JC's room. I shut the door, barricading with what we had, a few dressers, laundry basket, 2x4. We started hearing someone running up the stairs, scratching the door, going into AC's room. We had pretty thick walls, and hearing how something sniffed the room and tore it apart. The lights came back on, AC was crying her ass off and JC was paralyzed by fear. The temperature became very chilling, you could taste the tension. I was so pale. We decided to play Halo 3 to try to drown out the noise. We turned on the TV, which turned off a few times, but after a while it started working. We must have passed out, but when we awoke the next morning, my aunt had already arrived and had people checking the house, moved out and went to my grandma's, which has a few stories to tell about some good scares, some legend about the house. A few weeks later I overheard my aunt saying something about a portal in her bedroom that was welcoming something. I think they took a priest to clean the place. And that's about it. This happened when I was about 3 to 5 months pregnant with my son in 2012. It was a cold, dark night in October. I had gone over to my best friend's house, and after spending all afternoon gossiping and watching foreign films, I realized it had gotten too dark for me to drive home. Country roads have little to no lights, so I decided to spend the night. It was around 10 p.m. when my best friend's mother came into the room and asked us to turn off the lights and TV so we could go bed. I tried to sleep but was too restless to get into a comfortable position, so I started a conversation with my friend about where she pictured herself in 10 years. I was laying on the left side of the bed, her chihuahua was in the middle and my friend laid on the right side. The only light in the room came from a small, black alarm clock with bright red numbers. My best friend had just started telling me about what major she had switched over to when we first noticed it. At the edge of the bed, the blanket had been lifted and we noticed something crawling towards us, underneath the single blanket we shared. We both laid perfectly still as it made its way towards us. Our eyes remained focused on the movement and we felt the bed sinking with the pressure of whatever was crawling underneath. It seemed to grow larger and we started to make out what looked like shoulders, and a head. Her chihuahua came out from underneath the covers and looked at the object as it reached the end of the blanket. Suddenly, a bright orb of light came out and lingered by our heads for a few seconds, dancing in between us, then flying up over us, hitting the wall and disappearing. We looked at each other in disbelief for a few seconds when I noticed more movement at the foot of the bed. It was then that I saw a brown-eyed little girl with short curly hair. She was looking at me, confused. I couldn't move. In the background, I heard my friend trying to make sense of the situation, but my gaze remained fixated on the girl. It was at that point my friend became incoherent to me. She might as well have been talking in another language. I just stared at the girl, her confused face, wondering who she was, what she wanted, how she got here. Suddenly my friend said something that caused me to turn to her. Annoyance was evident in my voice as I asked her what she wanted. When I looked back around to where the girl had been standing, she was gone. I felt scared of the unknown, and although I could no longer see her physically, I could still sense her presence. I could feel where she was standing, at the edge of the closet, watching me with a newfound curiosity. I could sense her facial expressions, and that smirk she got as she realized I could feel her too. If it hadn't been so dark outside, and I hadn't been so scared of her appearing in my rear view window, I would have left that house that night. But I didn't. Instead, I laid back in bed, faced her, watching, waiting, until I finally fell asleep. In a house that my family lives in, where I also lived before I got married, I once woke up during the night to a woman standing in the corner of my room. She was middle-aged, not fat, but soft, and had brown hair that was pinned up. She was wearing a dress made out of a fabric with a sort of check pattern on it, like the kind of dress that you would imagine someone would wear to a barn dance. I don't remember exactly what she said, except that she was very nice, and that she was asking me if I liked square dancing. I remember at the time being almost in shock. I wasn't scared of her, she seemed excited, like she just really wanted to talk to me. I was just plain scared that there was an anomalous woman in my bedroom. I remember laying back down and covering my head with the blanket, and closing my eyes tight, hoping she would disappear. After that I must have fallen back asleep, and everything was fine. I figured I had either had a paranormal experience, or a really odd dream, since I clearly remember waking up out of sleep when it happened. Years later, my cousin was staying out here at my parents' house for his summer break from college. One day after sleeping over there in my old bedroom, he starts telling me that the weirdest thing happened, and he woke up during the night to a woman standing in the corner of the room. He went on to describe the exact same woman, down to the dress, and tell me that she was trying to talk to him about square dancing. My jaw just dropped open. I had never told him about her. I have never told anyone this before, and it's not the first paranormal experience I've had. My granddad died a couple of years ago, and he was in ill health before, so it was to be expected at some point. I remember it was a Saturday night and I was home alone watching TV. About 9ish I saw something out the corner of my eye. I felt like someone was with me, and I instantly knew it was my granddad and that he had passed. Feeling pretty upset, I just sat on the sofa not knowing what to think. Sure enough, my dad called at 9:30 to tell me granddad had died. My other experience was when I was younger. We went to visit one of my stepdad's friends who lived nearby. I must have been about 13 to 14 years old. Quite impressionable. I remember the guy telling me his house was haunted by his mother, who was often seen standing at the end of his bed, and every Christmas she would flick the lights on and off, among other things. At first I thought he was just trying to scare me, so I left the adults talking in the kitchen and went to sit in the living room with the dog. As I opened the living room door, a cold white/gray mist passed over my arm like someone leaving the room and disappeared behind me. The dog started barking and wagging its tail as if it was happy to see it. I ran back to my mom but didn't say a word. I remember when I was about 9 years old, I went with my aunt to visit my grandparents in Dominican Republic. My mom had to stay in NYC to work because money was kinda short at the time. So anyways, one day I'm chilling in my grandparents' living room watching Courage the Cowardly Dog in Spanish, so I wasn't really paying attention to it. I look to the left of me past the dining room and see a tall black figure with spikes on the back gliding across the floor slowly into the other hallway at the other half of the house. I was frozen in shock as I couldn't believe what I just saw. I tried to tell myself that it was my grandma. No way in hell looked anything like her, lol, but I went into their room and they were both sleeping. Always was scared as hell of the place ever since, and mostly stayed in resorts from there on. I told my friend from DR and he said he has seen a similar thing. He said the locals call it some kind of shapeshifter or something. I also told my cousins recently about it and they've said that they always felt uneasy in that hallway. When I was little, young enough that the word paranormal wasn't even in my vocabulary, I was kind of thrown into believing. I knew just from my first experience that what I was dealing with was something that not everyone could or would discuss. And since then, I've kept it to myself for the most part, aside from the rare occasion that the subject comes up or when I'm in the company of others that believe. So I'll start from the beginning. Bear with me. I am half Filipino, half American. When I was 6, almost 7, my mom took me back to the Philippines for a visit. When we first arrived, my mom received news that an elderly man was ill, related somehow but I'm not sure, and so we paid a visit. The bed he was laying in was abnormally high off the ground in comparison to what's typical in the US. At my age and height, I was eye level with him when I walked in the room. As soon as he saw me, he became angry and started yelling in Tagalog. My mom sent me out of the room with relatives, telling me that the man didn't want kids around. Later that evening, he passed. Now, in the Philippines, funerals are a much different affair than what is typical in the States, and I remember the viewing, or whatever they call it, lasting into the night. The house was made of bamboo and 2 stories. The mourners were downstairs, crying and wailing as they do, while I was upstairs in bed, listening and curious. My aunt was just outside the bedroom door on the balcony watching everyone, and I was watching her. Then it happened. The bed, draped in a mosquito net, lifted off the floor and began to shake violently. No noise came from it as all 4 legs were off the floor. I tried to yell out but no sound would come from my mouth. Just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I cried out for my aunt and tried to tell her what happened the best way a 6-year-old could, but she assured me I was dreaming. We came back to the US and moved within a year or 2 from that trip. The house we moved to was on land that Native Americans were known to have spent time on. During the clearing of grass and trees, several arrowheads were found, which is something I was initially fascinated with. But what else I would find there was something I could have lived without. My bedroom door faced the bathroom door in this tiny hallway on the right side of my dad's house. To the left of my door was the guest room. At night, my parents made me leave my bedroom door open so should something happen, they could easily hear me or get to me. From my bed, I could see directly out the door, which isn't something I was fond of. Especially when I started getting a visitor. One night, a very, very large man slowly came out of the guest room and turned toward me. He was nearly as tall as the doorway and almost naked aside from brown fabric draped around his privates, a loincloth-esque garment, and he just stood there, staring. He never stepped into my room, never said a word, never let on that he was aggressive in any kind of way, but he would just stand there nearly every night. I tried telling my parents about it, but I was again told that I was either dreaming or that my eyes were playing tricks on me. My mom is more inclined to believe these things due to Filipino beliefs, but my dad is a no-nonsense Baptist man born and raised in the South. There's no such thing as ghosts. I just kept it to myself. My father still lives in that house, and a few years ago, he had a small dog that refused to go into the guest room. He would just stand in the hallway and bark into it. Around that same time, I started having very vivid dreams. The first was of a feather. Everything around the feather was black. All I could see was this feather in very clear detail. I could see the splits in it, the color variations from black to gray to white. It wasn't something I thought was significant until I was at my babysitter's house one afternoon. I was walking through her backyard with some other kids when I had the urge to look down. When I did, the same feather was lying just a few inches in front of my feet. I was fascinated by this until one dream came that led to something I had no desire to see. One night, I had another dream in which everything was black except for lights. There were no colors to the lights, just variations in how bright. I couldn't see anything else. I didn't think much of it, but then a few weeks pass and my parents and I are on our way home from a restaurant. We were forced to stop due to police blocking the road. From where I was sitting in the backseat, the lights from the emergency vehicles took the shape of the lights I had seen in my dream. The perspective I had from the backseat allowed the shapes and variations of brightness that I had dreamed about. When I realized this, everything felt as though it were happening in slow motion. They had the road blocked due to an accident. I saw a red sports car that had rear-ended, more or less slid under, a UPS truck and several emergency personnel walking around, but there seemed to be a lack of emergency in their pace. A day or 2 later, my parents tell me that they read in the paper that the 2 in the sports car died instantly. I didn't want the dreams anymore and I haven't had one since. Since my childhood, the rest of my life has been littered with experiences I can't explain. I once told a friend that when he talks about his home, I get images in my head just as I would if I were reading a book and trying to set the stage in my mind. I described to him what I thought his home looked like as I had never been there before, and he very excitedly said he'd call me right back. He then proceeded to send me pictures of every room in the house that I had indeed described with incredible accuracy. Once, my boyfriend, now husband, and I stayed with my mom for a night. Her house was set off the road enough to be surrounded by trees that blocked the street lights, so when night came, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Laying in bed, I felt my boyfriend move his leg over mine and I let it rest there for a while until the weight became uncomfortable. I tried to move but he didn't budge, so I didn't bother. Moments later, I feel him playing with my hair as he had done earlier in the evening. It's a pet peeve, so I asked him to please stop. He doesn't say anything, but then I feel him loop a lock of hair around his finger and yank it. At that point, I'm irritated, so quickly roll over to face him. Only I see that his back is turned to me and he's sound asleep. I wake him up and ask if he has his leg on mine or if he had been playing with my hair, and it was easy to see by the confusion and fear on his face that he had no idea what I was talking about. We slept with the light on the rest of the night. Fast forward to adulthood, shortly after becoming a mother, and I'm living in a 100-year-old house. My infant is seeing something in the black of night, giggling. The rooms would randomly feel very heavy. Candle flames would wildly flicker when the air was still. Individuals, including myself, would smell something burning, but no two people would ever smell it at the same time. Pets would behave strangely. Old music would play late at night. Heavy wooden doors would slowly open and close repeatedly on their own. The day we moved out, as I'm walking through the house to ensure we haven't left anything, I hear a little girl's voice say from behind me, "Bye bye." Fast forward again to living on Fort Ord in California. Shadow figures. Objects moving on their own. Something having conversations with my toddler in the middle of the night. EVP later said in a whisper, "Your baby can hear me." Pets behaving oddly. Footsteps up the stairs in the middle of the night. A traveling mumbling voice that would only target one person at a time, no matter how many were in the room. A very piercing scream of a woman that was never heard by everyone at once either. The only comfort was finding out via a military Facebook group that many other people that lived in the same neighborhood were having their own experiences. For the most part, things have calmed down. I see the occasional shadow figure or feel a cold spot here and there. I assume it won't be long before I find myself in hair-raising situations again. This has happened my entire life and I don't expect it to ever change. I was told once that I was possibly a beacon of light for the dead, like a lighthouse in a storm, that maybe they knew I could sense them. Maybe so.